The sound of his laughter didn't just fill the courtroom, it poisoned the air. Preston White, a man who owned half of Boston's waterfront real estate, looked at his wife, Sarah, standing alone at the defendant's table, and chuckled as she dismissed her attorney. He thought he had already won. He thought she was just the decorative wife he'd controlled for 12 years. But Preston made a fatal miscalculation that day. He forgot that before she was a mother, before she was silenced, she was something else entirely. What happened next didn't just wipe the smirk off his face. It made his lawyer reach for his briefcase, and the judge leaned forward with sudden, razor-sharp attention. This is the story of the day. A woman who'd been made invisible became impossible to ignore. Please subscribe to Timeless Stories, and let's keep breathing life into stories that were never meant to stay silent. Now, let's continue. The Honorable Catherine Morrison was not a woman known for her sentimentality. Sitting at the elevated bench of Courtroom 6A in the Suffolk County Family Court, she looked down over her reading glasses with the exhaustion of someone who had presided over too many bitter divorces and witnessed too little dignity. "Ms. Bennett," Judge Morrison said, her voice carrying the weight of authority earned over 3 decades on the bench. "Do I understand this correctly? You wish to dismiss Ms. Rodriguez? We are 5 minutes from opening statements." Sarah Bennett stood alone at the defendant's table. She wore a lavender suit, borrowed from her younger sister 3 days ago, that fit imperfectly across the shoulders. The fabric pulled slightly when she moved, a small but visible reminder that this wasn't her life anymore. Her hands rested on the polished wood surface, and they were shaking. Not dramatically, but with a fine, persistent tremor. She tried to hide by pressing her palms flat against the table. Across the aisle, Preston White reclined in his chair with the ease of inherited certainty. He was the embodiment of old Boston money. His suit was a custom Armani, cream-colored, probably worth more than Sarah's first car and her current rent combined. He leaned toward his attorney, Scott T. Price, a man whose reputation in Boston legal circles was built on making difficult spouses disappear, and whispered something that made them both smile. And then Preston did it. He laughed. It wasn't a loud guffaw. It was a low, dismissive sound. Barely more than a breath, but it carried across the silent courtroom like a slap. It was the sound of someone crushing an insect beneath their shoe, without breaking stride. "Your Honor." Scott T. Price rose smoothly, adjusting his platinum cufflinks with practiced precision. "With all due respect to Mrs. White, this is an extraordinarily complex case involving assets in the 9 figures, multiple properties, and offshore holdings. If she dismisses counsel at this stage, she is essentially forfeiting any meaningful defense. My client, Mr. White, simply wants to conclude this matter efficiently so everyone can move forward." He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. Perhaps the court should consider whether Ms. Bennett is equipped to make such decisions in her current emotional state. Preston's gold pen began its rhythm against the mahogany armrest. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was maddening in its regularity. Sarah took a slow breath through her nose. She could smell the coffee on Miss Rodriguez's breath as her attorney, court-appointed, overworked, defeated, pulled her briefcase closer and began organizing her withdrawal. Rodriguez had told her that morning, voice gentle with resignation. "Take the settlement, Sarah. The condo on Beacon Hill, the monthly stipend. Preston will destroy you if you fight. I've seen it happen." Sarah looked across at Preston. For 12 years, That man had shaped her reality. He had dictated what she wore, who she spoke to, how she styled her hair, what career she could have, which was none. He had convinced Boston society that he was the progressive billionaire who'd married for love, and she was the fortunate woman who'd escaped poverty through his generosity. "Ms. Bennett," Judge Morrison pressed, her grey eyebrows drawing together. "I need an answer." Sarah's voice emerged barely above a whisper. "Yes, Your Honor." "Speak up, please," the court reporter interjected, fingers poised over the stenotype machine. Sarah closed her eyes for a heartbeat. She remembered the night Preston had called her ungrateful at a charity gala, when she'd mentioned her Harvard degree to a donor. She remembered how he'd laughed, that same laugh, when she'd asked if she could volunteer at a legal aid clinic. She remembered her daughter Naomi, 10 years old, starting to straighten her beautiful natural hair without being asked, trying to meet standards Sarah had never named, but that hung heavy in their home. She opened her eyes. The tremor in her hands stopped. "Yes, Your Honor," Sarah said, her voice suddenly clear, filling the high-ceilinged courtroom with unexpected resonance. "I am dismissing Miss Rodriguez. I will be representing myself." Preston let out a genuine laugh this time, louder, his head shaking in theatrical disbelief. "Oh, this is priceless," he muttered, just loud enough for the first 2 rows to hear clearly. "Mr. White," Judge Morrison snapped, her patience thinning, "you will remain silent." But even as she reprimanded him, she turned back to Sarah with something that looked uncomfortably like pity. "Ma'am, I am obligated to warn you. You are facing one of Boston's most aggressive divorce attorneys. The rules of evidence are unforgiving. I cannot provide you with assistance. If you make procedural errors, you will bear the consequences. Are you certain about this decision?" "I am certain, Your Honor." Judge Morrison exhaled slowly, making a notation on her legal pad. "Very well. Ms. Rodriguez, you are formally excused. Ms. Bennett, as you are now proceeding pro se, you may deliver your opening statement." She glanced at the courtroom clock. "You have 10 minutes." The room fell into a silence so complete that the hum of the ventilation system became suddenly audible. A low, mechanical drone beneath the weight of collective anticipation. Preston leaned close to Scott T. Price, his voice a stage whisper meant to be overheard. "Watch this. She can't even decide what to order at dinner without checking with me first. She'll be crying within 3 minutes." Sarah stepped out from behind the defendant's table. She didn't walk to the podium where notes and water waited. Instead, she moved deliberately toward the center of the courtroom, turning to face Judge Morrison directly, then pivoting to look at Preston. She held nothing in her hands. No legal pad, no note cards, no lifeline. 12 years ago, Sarah began, her voice possessing an unexpected steadiness, a control that seemed to emerge from somewhere deep and previously locked away. "I met Preston White at a civil rights symposium hosted by the Boston Bar Association. He was charming. But what she was about to reveal would change everything in that courtroom, because Preston White hadn't just married Sarah Bennett. He had tried to erase her. Courtroom 6A was a monument to old Boston power. The walls were lined with dark mahogany panels that had absorbed decades of arguments, pleas, and verdicts. Brass fixtures gleamed under muted lighting that seemed designed to remind everyone who belonged here and who didn't. Oil portraits of former judges, all white, all men, looked down from their gilded frames with expressions of stern disapproval. The gallery seats were filled with Boston's legal elite, partners from white shoe firms, socialites who treated divorce proceedings like theater, and reporters who'd caught wind that Preston White's marriage was finally imploding. Sarah stood at the defendant's table in her borrowed lavender suit, and the disparity was impossible to ignore. The fabric bunched slightly at her shoulders, where her sister's frame didn't quite match hers. Across from her, Preston looked like he'd stepped from the pages of a luxury magazine. Cream Armani, perfectly tailored, his wedding ring already removed and replaced with a platinum signet bearing his family crest. She remembered the day he'd asked her to quit Brennan & Cole. They'd been engaged for 3 months, and she'd just been offered a promotion. Preston had taken her hands across the table at Mistral, Boston's most exclusive restaurant, and said with perfect gentleness, "A White needs a full-time wife, not a career woman. You understand, don't you? My position requires a certain kind of partnership." She'd noticed how he'd capitalized his last name in his tone, making it clear he wasn't just talking about the color of his suit. She remembered another night, the Hancock Foundation Gala, 3 years into their marriage. She'd worn her hair natural, the way she'd started styling it after having Naomi, feeling beautiful for the first time in months. Preston had taken one look at her in their bedroom and gone silent. Then, quietly, "Is that really how you want to present yourself tonight? As my wife?" She'd straightened it while he waited, watching in the mirror. Scott T. Price rose for his opening statement, and Sarah felt the room's attention shift like a spotlight. "Your Honor," he began, his voice smooth as aged whiskey, "this case is quite straightforward. Miss Bennett, who insisted on using Mr. White's name throughout their marriage, until this morning, I might add, saw an opportunity when she met my client 12 years ago. A wealthy, accomplished man with an impeccable reputation. She positioned herself strategically." He paused, letting the insinuation settle. Now, after enjoying every privilege his name and resources provided, she's making wildly aggressive demands. Demanding the family home, demanding majority custody, demanding assets she had no hand in building. Each use of demanding landed like an accusation. The opportunistic nature of these requests speaks for itself. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the gallery. Sarah heard the whispers, saw the knowing looks exchanged between women in pearls who'd never worked a day in their lives, but somehow felt qualified to judge her. Preston leaned toward Price, his whisper theatrical. 5 minutes. She'll be crying in 5 minutes. Sarah's hands gripped her notepad until the paper crinkled audibly. She forced herself to breathe. 1, 2, 3. The counting technique she'd taught herself years ago when Preston's father had called her articulate with such surprise at a family dinner that she'd nearly walked out. She couldn't afford to be angry. Angry black women didn't win in courtrooms like this. "Mrs. White," Judge Morrison said, shuffling her papers, "are you prepared to deliver your opening statement?" Sarah closed her eyes. In that darkness, she saw Naomi's face, saw her daughter starting to make herself smaller the way Sarah had. She opened her eyes, and something fundamental had shifted, like a lock clicking open after years of being sealed. "It's Miss Bennett, Your Honor." Her voice was steady, clear. "And yes, I am." Sarah didn't walk to the podium where a glass of water waited beside a microphone. Instead, she moved to the center of the courtroom, positioning herself between the judge's bench and the empty jury box. This was a bench trial, no jury to persuade, but she wanted Judge Morrison to see her fully, without barriers, without distance. "Your Honor," Sarah began, her voice carrying a precision that hadn't been there moments before. "I'd like to correct several misstatements in Mr. Price's opening." Scott T. Price's pen stopped mid-notation. Preston shifted forward in his chair. "First," Sarah continued, turning slightly so her words reached the entire gallery, "I didn't meet Preston at a charity event where I happened to be serving hors d'oeuvres or admiring the decor. I was the keynote speaker at a civil rights symposium hosted by the Boston Bar Association. Preston attended for business networking. His company was being investigated for housing discrimination at the time. The optics of that symposium photograph, him shaking hands with a black female attorney, proved quite useful in his subsequent settlement negotiations." The whispers started immediately, a rustling wave through the gallery. Someone's program slipped from their lap and hit the floor with a sharp crack. "Second," Sarah said, her cadence unchanging, "I didn't quit my job when we married. Preston made my employment at Brennan & Cole a non-negotiable condition of his proposal. His exact words were, 'No wife of mine will work. A white needs a full-time wife, not a career woman.'" She paused, letting the statement breathe. "I was 3 months from making junior partner." Preston's face had gone the color of an old newspaper. His hand reached for his water glass and missed, knocking it slightly. Scott T. Price steadied it, without looking away from Sarah. "Third," Sarah said, and now she turned to face Preston directly. "The name is Sarah Bennett. I legally reclaimed my maiden name this morning at 8:45 a.m. The paperwork was processed before I walked into this courtroom." She reached into the slim folder she'd carried, the only item she'd brought with her, and produced 3 documents, walking them to the court clerk with movements that were unhurried, deliberate. "My Harvard Law School diploma, class of 2008. My Massachusetts State Bar card, maintained and in good standing. And my law school transcript shows I graduated in the top 10% of my class." Judge Morrison leaned forward, taking the documents from the clerk. The courtroom had gone so quiet that the rustle of paper sounded like thunder. "Mr. Price called me an opportunist," Sarah said, returning to the center of the room. "Perhaps he's right. I saw an opportunity to believe that a man could love me for who I am, not what I represent to his investors and business partners, not as a diversity shield, not as proof of his progressive values." Her voice didn't rise, but it filled every corner of the room. "That was my mistake." Judge Morrison set down her pen, sitting straighter in her chair, the subtle shift radiating attention that hadn't been there before. "Ms. Bennett," she said slowly, "why did you allow your husband to represent you as less educated than you are?" Sarah met the judge's eyes. "Because he asked me to, Your Honor. And for 12 years, I believed that love meant making yourself smaller, so someone else could feel bigger. I believed that a good wife would be accommodated, that a good mother sacrificed, that a good black woman didn't make white spaces uncomfortable with her competence." She paused. "I was wrong." Scott T. Price shot to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the floor. "Your Honor, this is clearly—" Preston's hand clamped onto his attorney's forearm, yanking him back down with such force that Price's briefcase toppled from the table. Preston's face was rigid, his jaw working soundlessly. He shook his head once, sharply, and Price, after a moment of visible confusion, slowly sat back down. Sarah watched the exchange, then turned back to Judge Morrison. "If there are no objections," she said quietly, "I'd like to enter Exhibit A into evidence." She reached into her folder again and produced a leather-bound book, roughly the size of a journal, its cover embossed with gold lettering. She held it up so the gallery could see. This is what my husband called the Wife Handbook. And what was inside that handbook would prove that Preston White hadn't just controlled his wife. He had tried to systematically destroy her. Before we continue, I need to tell you something. If you're listening right now, help me prove something wrong. My mother said I wouldn't even reach 500 subscribers, but I believe stories like this deserve to be heard. Help me show her that these tales matter. Hit that subscribe button, and let's prove that voices like Sarah's need to be amplified. Now, let's see what was inside that handbook. Sarah opened the leather-bound book with the careful reverence one might use with evidence of a crime. Because that's what it was. The pages were thick, professionally printed, with tab dividers color-coded by category. It wasn't a journal filled with a husband's scattered thoughts. It was a manual, a systematic blueprint for erasure. Rule 7, Sarah read, her voice steady. Hair must be straightened for all public events, corporate functions, and family gatherings. Natural styles are acceptable only for private, casual settings. She looked up briefly, catching the eyes of several women in the gallery. Rule 14. Do not discuss your education or career history with my business associates. If asked about your background, redirect to charitable interests or the children. The courtroom had become a held breath. Sarah continued. Rule 23. All spending over $500 requires written permission, submitted via the household account portal. Exceptions are not granted for medical expenses without prior consultation. Her fingers turned to another tabbed section. Rule 31. Do not discipline the children without my approval. All parenting decisions must be cleared through me first, as their behavior reflects on the family name. She flipped to a section marked Public Presentation and held it up. The gallery craned forward. Mounted on the page were 2 photographs of Sarah, one with straightened hair, minimal makeup, wearing a conservative dress labeled Acceptable. The other showed her with natural curls, brighter lipstick, in a more colorful outfit, labeled Unacceptable. Scott T. Price was on his feet before the murmuring could build. Your Honor, this is clearly a forgery designed to embarrass my client. Anyone with access to a printer and a leather binding could— It's notarized, Mr. Price, Sarah interrupted, her tone clinical. Page 47, by Catherine Chen, the notary at Vance & Hart. She paused, letting that sink in. Your firm's notary. The blood drained from Price's face. He opened his mouth, closed it, and looked at Preston. Preston lunged forward in his chair, hands gripping the table edge. That was a joke. It was satire. Sarah, tell them. It was a joke between us. A funny— Mr. White, Judge Morrison's voice cut through the courtroom like a blade. Sit down and be quiet, now. Preston sank back, but his hands remained on the table, knuckles white. Sarah turned another page, finding a specific rule. Your Honor, Rule 19 states, remember, you represent the White family now. Act accordingly. She looked up at Judge Morrison. I'd like the court to note that White is capitalized. It wasn't just about his last name. The silence that followed was suffocating. In the gallery, a woman in a Chanel suit looked down at her lap, her jaw tight. Another dabbed at her eyes with a tissue. Sarah returned to the table and retrieved a manila envelope. These are bank statements from our joint accounts covering the 12 years of our marriage. She walked them to the clerk. Your Honor will note that I was given a $500 monthly allowance for personal expenses, clothing, hair care, and incidentals. During that same period, Preston's personal spending averaged 6 figures monthly. The statements also show that my independent access to our accounts was revoked 3 years into the marriage. From that point forward, all my transactions required his pre-approval. She pulled out another document. These are receipts I was required to submit for reimbursement. School supplies for our children. A winter coat for Naomi when she outgrew her old one. A pair of shoes for Marcus. Her voice remained level, but something harder crept into it. I had to justify $52 for my son's sneakers, while my husband spent $8,000 on a golf weekend in Scotland. Judge Morrison was reading the handbook now, her expression unreadable, but her posture rigid with attention. Sarah walked back to the center of the courtroom. The handbook has an appendix. Your Honor, it's titled Corrective Measures. It details the appropriate responses when rules are violated, withdrawal of privileges, public correction, silent treatment protocols. She reached into her folder one more time, producing a small digital recorder. I'd like to play audio recording 1A, dated March 15th, 2 years ago. She pressed play. Preston's voice filled the courtroom, and several people flinched at its venom. The audio quality was crisp, almost too clear. Background noise of clinking glasses and low music. A bar or club, somewhere expensive where men like Preston felt comfortable saying anything. His voice came through the small speaker with casual cruelty. You know why I married Sarah? Optics, man. The board wanted diversity initiatives after that housing discrimination lawsuit. What better than a black wife? Shows I'm progressive without actually changing a damn thing. Best PR move I ever made. A friend's voice, slightly slurred. But she's smart, right? Harvard or something. Preston's laugh was ugly, familiar. That's the beauty of it. I made her quit. Told her a white doesn't work. Had to capitalize it so she'd get it, you know. Now she's just decorative. And when the kids came, even better. You know how many contracts I've landed because of those biracial kids? Worth millions. Literally millions. Sarah stopped the recording. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. She pressed play on the next file. Preston's voice again. Different setting. Her hair looked like she stuck her finger in a socket. I told her, "You want to embarrass me at my own charity event?" She straightened it. They always do what you tell them if you say it the right way. Another recording. Preston's voice had the flat tone of discussing a business transaction. She doesn't know about Michelle or Diane. She wouldn't leave if she did. Where would she go? She's got no career, no money, no options. I made sure of that. The final recording was Preston speaking to someone Sarah identified quietly as his accountant. Move everything offshore before I file. The Cayman accounts, the shell companies, all of it. She won't know how to find it. She's been a housewife for 12 years. She probably doesn't even remember how to read a balance sheet. Sarah stopped the playback and set the recorder down gently on the table. The courtroom remained frozen. Preston sat motionless, his skin the color of old chalk. Both hands gripping the edge of the table as if it were the only thing keeping him upright. Scott T. Price was writing furiously on his legal pad, his pen moving so fast it tore the paper. In the gallery, a woman had her hand over her mouth. A man in the third row shook his head slowly, continuously, as if trying to unsee what he'd just heard. Judge Morrison removed her glasses with deliberate care, setting them beside her gavel. "Mr. White," she said, her voice carrying a weight that made several people flinch, "I'm going to ask you directly. Did you make those statements?" Preston's mouth opened and closed twice before sound emerged. That's out of context. That's—" His voice climbed an octave. "This is illegal wiretapping. She can't." "Massachusetts is a one-party consent state, Your Honor," Sarah said calmly. "I was present for every conversation on those recordings. I've been documenting for 5 years. Everything you've heard is completely legal." Scott T. Price looked up from his frantic notes, and Sarah watched the realization cross his face. This wasn't just about losing a divorce case anymore. His client had admitted to fraud on tape, to asset concealment, to systematic financial abuse. Criminal charges weren't a possibility. They were inevitable. Preston was standing now, swaying slightly. "You vindictive. You planned this. You've been planning—" "Mr. White, sit down," Judge Morrison commanded. "Now." He sat, but his eyes remained locked on Sarah, with something that looked like recognition finally breaking through. She wasn't the woman he thought he'd married. She had never been. Sarah turned back to the judge. "I have 47 hours of audio, Your Honor, but I think the court gets the picture." She paused, smoothing her borrowed lavender jacket. "What I'd like to address now is where the money actually went. The offshore accounts Preston mentioned, the shell companies, the systematic asset concealment." She looked toward the gallery. "I'd like to call Preston's former executive assistant, Jennifer Carlson, to the stand." A woman in the third row stood up, her expression grim and resolved, and Preston's face went from white to gray. Because Jennifer Carlson knew everything, and she had receipts. Jennifer Carlson walked to the witness stand with the steady gait of someone who'd made a decision and wouldn't be backing down. She was a white woman in her early 50s, wearing a navy suit that spoke of professionalism earned over decades, not purchased for effect. Her gray-streaked hair was pulled into a neat bun, and when she placed her hand on the Bible to be sworn in, her fingers didn't shake. Sarah approached the stand, her movements still deliberate, controlled. "Miss Carlson, how long did you work for Preston White?" 15 years. I started as his executive assistant in 2010, shortly after he founded White Properties." "And what were your primary responsibilities?" Jennifer's voice was clear, practiced. "I managed his calendar, organized travel, coordinated meetings, and handled correspondence. I knew his schedule better than he did. I knew his business better than most of his partners." Sarah nodded. "Did those travel arrangements include trips to the Cayman Islands?" "Yes. 4 to 6 times per year, usually for 3 to 4 days each trip." "And how were those flights booked?" Jennifer didn't hesitate. "Under his middle name. Preston Andrew White became Andrew White for those reservations. He said it was for privacy, but the credit cards were linked to business accounts, so the expenses wouldn't show up under his primary name in standard audits." Sarah walked to her table and retrieved a document. "Did you schedule meetings for Mr. White with someone identified as LK?" "Lawrence Kincaid?" "Yes, multiple times per month, often at locations that weren't Preston's usual offices. Hotel conference rooms, private clubs. Once at a construction site in Southie at 6 in the morning." "Did you ever notarize documents for Mr. White?" Jennifer's jaw tightened. "Yes, I'm a licensed notary. He had me notarize documents for an entity called Whitehaven LLC. It was registered in the Cayman Islands. The paperwork transferred property titles, moved assets, millions of dollars. Scott T. Price shot to his feet, his earlier panic now channeled into aggression. Ms. Carlson, isn't it true that you were fired 6 months ago? That you're a disgruntled former employee with an axe to grind? Jennifer turned to face him directly. I quit, Mr. Price. I resigned. After Preston asked me to forge Miss Bennett's signature on a prenuptial amendment that would have stripped her of custody rights and any claim to marital assets. I refused. I quit that day. The gallery erupted in gasps and whispers. Judge Morrison's gavel came down once, sharply. Jennifer reached into her bag and produced a USB drive, setting it on the witness stand rail. Next came a manila folder thick with papers. I kept copies, emails, travel receipts, meeting notes, and wire transfer confirmations. 15 years of documentation. Sarah felt something loosen in her chest. Relief, solidarity, the knowledge that she wasn't fighting alone. Ms. Carlson, what did those financial records show? Whitehaven LLC currently holds approximately $12 million in assets that should be classified as marital property. The transfers began 2 months before Preston filed for divorce. But that wasn't the first time. Jennifer paused, glancing at Preston. I found similar patterns before his first marriage ended in 2008. Assets moved offshore, then transferred back after the settlement was finalized. He's done this before. Preston erupted from his chair, his arm shooting out. Finger pointed at Jennifer like a weapon. You signed an NDA. This is illegal. You can't. Mr. White, Judge Morrison's voice was ice. Sit down immediately, or I will hold you in contempt. This is your final warning. Preston remained standing for a heartbeat, his whole body trembling with rage, before Scott T. Price pulled him back down into his seat. Judge Morrison turned to Jennifer. Ms. Carlson, you mentioned an NDA. Yes, Your Honor. But I consulted with an attorney before coming here today. NDAs don't protect criminal activity. They can't be used to conceal fraud or prevent testimony in legal proceedings. Sarah walked back to the center of the courtroom. Thank you, Miss Carlson. Your Honor, I'd like to present financial records showing the flow of money from Whitehaven LLC to a separate entity called Kincaid Properties. She paused, letting the name settle. I believe we need to discuss my husband's business partner, Lawrence Kincaid, and why half of Boston's newest luxury condos are built on money laundering. The courtroom went silent again, but this time the silence felt different. It felt like the moment before a building collapses. Sarah walked to a laptop connected to the courtroom's projection system, equipment typically reserved for corporate litigation, not divorce proceedings. The screen behind Judge Morrison flickered to life, displaying a flowchart that looked like a spider's web of financial connections. Shell companies, offshore accounts, property transfers. Lines connecting names and dates and dollar amounts that made several people in the gallery lean forward, squinting. Lawrence Kincaid, Sarah said, using a small remote to highlight a name at the center of the web, is Preston's silent business partner. He's been involved in every major development project Preston's undertaken for the past decade. She clicked through slides. The money flows like this. Offshore accounts in the Caymans, transferred to Whitehaven LLC, then moved to Kincaid Properties, and finally dispersed to development projects across Boston. She advanced to the next slide. Bank records, wire transfers, construction permits. Preston wasn't just hiding assets from me. He was hiding the source of those assets, where the money came from, how it moved, Who does it go to? The next slide showed payment records. Kincaid Properties paid contractors in cash. Large cash payments that leave no paper trail. These buildings, she clicked to photos of luxury condos, gleaming glass towers, failed initial inspections, structural issues, foundation problems, substandard concrete. But they were approved anyway. Another click. City officials who approved these projects received consulting fees ranging from $50,000 to $200,000, paid through subsidiary companies that trace back to Kincaid. Scott T. Price was on his feet. Your Honor, I need to request an immediate recess to consult with... Motion denied, Judge Morrison said flatly. Sit down, Mr. Price. Sarah turned away from the screen to face the courtroom. Preston's role in all of this was to be the respectable face, the legitimate businessman, the philanthropist, the man married to a black woman, father to biracial children, is proof that he cared about diversity and community. Her voice didn't rise, but it hardened. His marriage to me was part of the legitimacy theater. I was a prop in a criminal enterprise. She paused, took a breath. Your Honor, I need to admit something. I haven't been a housewife for the past 5 years. I've been working pro bono from home, handling civil rights cases through Brennan & Cole's legal aid program. I kept my bar status active. I took cases quietly, without Preston's knowledge. She clicked to another slide, a case file. 3 years ago, one of my clients was a construction worker named Miguel Torres. He was injured when a Kincaid Properties building's foundation cracked during construction. He fell 2 stories. He'll never walk without a cane again. The courtroom was absolutely still. That's when I started investigating. That's when I began documenting everything. Sarah returned to her table and lifted a binder so thick it barely fit in her hands. 3 inches of paper, tabbed and indexed. This contains evidence of building code violations, bribery, and fraud spanning 8 years. Photographs, witness statements, financial records, engineering reports. She set it on the clerk's desk with a heavy thud. I've provided copies to the Massachusetts Attorney General, the FBI, and the IRS. They've had them for 6 months. Preston exploded from his chair, sending it toppling backward with a crash that echoed through the courtroom. You vindictive bitch! This is because I wanted a divorce. You're trying to destroy me. Sarah turned to face him, and her expression was almost pitying. No, Preston. I'm trying to stop you from getting people killed with your cheap concrete and bribed inspectors. The divorce is just personal. She paused. This is about justice. Judge Morrison's gavel came down like a gunshot. We're taking a 30-minute recess. Mr. Price, I strongly suggest you speak with your client about potential criminal exposure. Court officers, please ensure Mr. White remains calm. She looked at Preston, who was being steadied by 2 officers. Mr. White, if you cannot control yourself, I will have you removed from these proceedings. Do you understand? Preston didn't answer. He was staring at Sarah like he'd never seen her before. As the gallery began filing out, Sarah felt her phone buzz in her pocket. She pulled it out, glanced at the screen. Unknown number. A text message. Parking garage, level 3, now. LK. Her hands went cold. Because Lawrence Kincaid didn't just want to talk. He wanted to make sure Sarah understood what happened to people who threatened his empire. The parking garage was dim even in midday, the fluorescent lights flickering in irregular patterns that cast strange shadows between the concrete pillars. Sarah's footsteps echoed as she walked toward level 3, each step feeling heavier than the last. She told herself she was being paranoid, that Lawrence Kincaid just wanted to talk, that this was still a legal matter, not something else. But her hands were already shaking. He emerged from between a black Mercedes and a silver Lexus like he'd been waiting there, patient as a predator. Lawrence Kincaid was in his late 50s, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Sarah's borrowed one by a factor of 20. His hair was silver at the temples, his face tanned and lined in a way that suggested ski vacations and yacht clubs, but his eyes were cold, flat. "You've made a very stupid mistake, Miss Bennett." Sarah stopped walking, her heart hammering against her ribs. She was suddenly acutely aware of how alone she was, how the parking garage stretched empty in all directions, how far away the courthouse entrance seemed. Kincaid didn't move closer. He didn't need to. "Naomi has ballet on Tuesdays, right? That little studio on Newbury Street? The one with the pink sign?" He said it conversationally, like he was making small talk. "She's quite talented. Your teacher says she has real potential." Sarah's breath caught. Her feet moved backward without her conscious decision, one step, then another. "And Marcus," Kincaid continued, his tone never changing. "He takes school bus number 47, sits in the 3rd row, usually by the window. He likes to draw in that little notebook with the dinosaurs on the cover." Sarah's back hit her car. Her hands fumbled for her keys, fingers numb and clumsy. "Here's how this works," Kincaid said, sliding his hands into his pockets. "You withdraw the complaint. You call the FBI and tell them you were mistaken, that you were angry about the divorce and exaggerated. You take your settlement. I'll make sure it's generous, and you go away. You and your children live comfortably, safely, quietly. Everyone's happy." Sarah's voice came out strangled. You're threatening my children." "I'm describing your children," Kincaid corrected, that cold smile never wavering. "I'm stating facts. What you do with those facts is your decision." Sarah forced herself to breathe, forced her mind to work through the terror. "Mr. Kincaid," she said, her voice still shaking but gaining strength, "I'm going to assume you didn't hire a private investigator to follow my children. I'm going to assume you're just repeating information Preston told you about their routines. Because if you've been surveilling minors, that's a felony. That's a separate criminal charge." Kincaid's smile didn't falter. "Assume whatever helps you sleep at night, Miss Bennett." He turned to walk away, then paused. "You have 24 hours. Make the right choice." Sarah watched him disappear between the cars, heard his footsteps fade. Then she yanked open her car door, threw herself inside, and locked all the doors with trembling fingers. The breakdown came fast. Sobs that tore through her chest, fear that she'd been holding back for hours, days, years. She pressed her hands over her mouth to muffle the sound, but then, slowly, she stopped, breathed, wiped her face. She pulled out her phone with hands that were steadying, breath by breath, and dialed a number she'd programmed months ago, a number she'd hoped she'd never need to use. "This is Sarah Bennett," she said, her voice clear now, certain. "Authorization code Bennett 779. Execute safeguard protocol." 30 seconds later, black SUVs with federal plates pulled up to the office building, 2 blocks from the courthouse. FBI agents in tactical gear moved through the glass doors of Kincaid Properties with the precision of a military operation. Simultaneously, IRS agents arrived at the White Haven Properties office in the financial district, badges out, warrants in hand. State police vehicles converged on the courthouse parking garage. Sarah sat in her car, watching through the rear window as Lawrence Kincaid was intercepted at the garage entrance. 4 officers surrounded him. She saw his face, shock first, then rage, then the terrible realization of someone who'd just made a fatal miscalculation. She pulled down the visor mirror, wiped away the tear tracks with a tissue from her purse, and reapplied her lipstick with steady hands. She smoothed her borrowed lavender jacket. Then Sarah Bennett got out of her car and walked back toward the courthouse, her head high. When the court reconvened, the gallery looked different. FBI agents in dark suits occupied the back row, their presence transforming the mahogany-paneled room into something else entirely. Judge Morrison returned to her bench with a stack of documents she hadn't had before. Federal warrants, Sarah realized. Someone had briefed her during the recess. Preston and Scott T. Price walked back in together, Price speaking rapidly in Preston's ear. They both stopped dead when they saw the agents. Preston's face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally, something that looked like understanding, arriving far too late. Judge Morrison settled into her chair. "Miss Bennett, I believe you have something to explain to the court." Sarah stood, and this time there was no tremor in her hands, no borrowed confidence. This was hers. "Your Honor, 5 years ago I began documenting everything. Every conversation, every financial transaction, every rule violation in that handbook, every instance of control." She turned slightly so the entire courtroom could hear her. 3 years ago, when I took the case of Miguel Torres, the construction worker injured at a Kincaid Properties site, I contacted the FBI and IRS with preliminary findings. Evidence of fraud, money laundering, and building code violations. She paused, letting it sink in. 6 months ago, I provided them with enough evidence for warrants, bank records, audio recordings, testimony from contractors, city officials, and workers. Everything you've seen today is the surface. The real investigation has been happening quietly, in federal offices, for half a year. Preston's hands gripped the table edge, his knuckles bone white. "This morning, before coming to court, I activated what I called Safeguard Protocol. It's a dead man's switch. If I didn't check in every 2 hours, or if anything happened to my children or me, the complete file, every document, every recording, every piece of evidence would be automatically released to federal authorities and major media outlets." Her voice remained steady. "Mr. Kincaid's threat in the parking garage 40 minutes ago gave the FBI probable cause for immediate arrest. They were already positioned, waiting. He gave them the justification they needed." The courtroom was silent, except for Preston's ragged breathing. "The pro bono work I did wasn't just charity, Your Honor. I was gathering testimonies, building a pattern, connecting dots between construction injuries, code violations, bribery, and money laundering. Every worker I helped, every case I took, added another piece to the federal investigation." 2 FBI agents stood and approached the defense table. The taller one spoke. "Preston Andrew White, you're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and conspiracy to commit bribery." He read Miranda rights as another agent produced handcuffs. Preston twisted in his seat as the cuffs closed around his wrists, his eyes locked on Sarah. "I gave you everything." His voice cracked, desperate and furious. "I made you somebody. You were nothing before me. Nothing." Sarah met his gaze without flinching. "No, Preston. You tried to make me nobody. You tried to erase me, silence me, Reduce me to a decoration you could put on a shelf." She paused. "I made myself somebody again. I did that. Not you." The agents led him toward the door. Preston stumbled, and they steadied him with professional efficiency. Scott T. Price rose slowly, his expensive suit suddenly looking rumpled despite its perfect tailoring. "Your Honor, given these developments, I move to withdraw as counsel. I was clearly misled by my client about the scope of his activities, the nature of his assets, the—" "Motion denied," Judge Morrison said crisply. "Mr. Price, you will see this through. You represented Mr. White throughout these proceedings. You'll remain as counsel of record until all matters are resolved." Price sat down heavily, all fight gone from him. Judge Morrison turned to Sarah, removing her glasses once more. The courtroom felt smaller suddenly, more intimate. "Ms. Bennett, I'm prepared to rule on the divorce and custody matters. The outcome seems clear given what's transpired." She paused, her expression shifting from judge to something more human. "But first, I have a question. Why did you wait so long? Why endure 12 years of this treatment?" Sarah took a breath, and for the first time all day, her eyes showed the weight she'd been carrying. Because the answer to that question wasn't about Preston. It wasn't about the law. It wasn't even about justice. It was about a little girl who was learning to make herself smaller, and a mother who finally decided that love doesn't mean disappearing. Sarah looked at Judge Morrison, and the weight of 12 years showed in her eyes. "Your Honor, I stayed because I believed that's what strong women do. I grew up watching my mother survive my father's abuse by being quiet, by accommodating, by making herself smaller and smaller until she almost disappeared." Her voice caught, and she let it. "I thought that's what love looked like, sacrifice and silence. I thought that's what marriage meant for women like me." She paused, gathering herself. "And there was a part of me, a part I'm ashamed to admit, that thought Preston was right, that I was lucky he chose me, that a black woman from a working-class family in Dorchester should be grateful for the life he gave me, that I should be thankful he overlooked my background, my skin, my hair, everything that made me me." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of someone crying softly in the gallery. "But then I watched my daughter, Naomi, start to shrink the way I had." She stopped raising her hand in class. She started straightening her hair without me asking. She apologized for taking up space. She was 10 years old, and she was becoming me. Sarah's voice strengthened. And I realized, if I stayed silent, I was teaching her that this is what she deserves, that this is what love looks like. I couldn't do that. I couldn't watch her learn to disappear. Judge Morrison nodded slowly, and when she spoke, her voice was gentle. "Thank you for your honesty, Ms. Bennett." She picked up her gavel. "I'm prepared to issue my ruling. Miss Bennett is granted full physical custody of both minor children. Mr. White will be permitted supervised visitation pending the outcome of criminal proceedings. Marital assets will be divided 65% to Ms. Bennett, 35% to Mr. White. Given the extensive financial misconduct, Mr. White is ordered to pay child support and Miss Bennett's legal fees. And yes, even though you represented yourself, this court recognizes the extraordinary attorney work you performed." A slight smile. "Restraining orders are granted against both Preston White and Lawrence Kincaid. This court is adjourned." The gavel came down with finality. 3 months later, Sarah sat in a corner office at Brennan and Cole, sunlight streaming through windows that overlooked Boston Harbor. The name on her door read, "Sarah Bennett, partner, Economic Justice Division, in elegant lettering. She wore a navy suit she'd chosen herself, professional, powerful, and authentically her. Her hair was natural, styled in beautiful curls that framed her face. Across from her sat a Latina woman in her mid-30s, hands twisting in her lap. "My husband says I'll never win," the woman whispered. "He says no one will believe me, that I'm crazy, that I'm making it all up." Sarah leaned forward, her expression warm but serious. "I want to tell you something. 3 months ago, I stood in a courtroom alone. My husband laughed at me. His lawyer dismissed me. Half the people there thought I was a gold digger trying to steal from a good man." She paused. "But I spoke anyway. I told my truth, and everything changed." The woman's eyes filled with tears. "I'm so scared." "I know," Sarah said softly, "but you're not alone anymore. We're going to document everything. Build your case. And when you're ready, you're going to speak. And I'm going to be right there with you." At the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Bennett Foundation for Economic Justice, Sarah held the oversized scissors while reporters' cameras flashed. The sign behind her promised free legal services for women escaping financial abuse. Behind the sign, she could see the faces of women, dozens of them, who'd already reached out for help. Sarah picked up Naomi from school on a crisp autumn afternoon. Her daughter climbed into the car, backpack sliding off one shoulder, face bright with excitement. "Mom, we had to present our heroes in class today." "Oh, yeah?" Sarah smiled, pulling into traffic. "Who did you choose?" "You, Mom. I told them about the day you went to court and weren't afraid anymore." Sarah pulled over, her vision blurring with tears. "Baby, I was terrified." Naomi looked at her seriously. "But you did it anyway. That's what makes you a hero." Sarah pulled her daughter into a hug, and her voice became a whisper that somehow filled the world. "Preston was right about one thing. I am an opportunist. I took the opportunity to use my voice, to break the silence, to make sure that what happened to me doesn't happen to you. They tried to make me smaller so they could feel bigger. I'm done shrinking." They walked away hand in hand, mother and daughter, the Boston skyline rising behind them, a city that once belonged only to people like Preston. Now a city where Sarah's foundation was helping women reclaim their power, one voice at a time. And that's the story of Sarah Bennett, the woman who was told she was nothing, the woman who was laughed at in a courtroom, the woman who proved that the most dangerous thing you can do to someone is to underestimate them. Because when you try to erase someone, when you try to silence them, when you try to make them invisible, sometimes they come back, and when they do, they bring receipts. If this story moved you, if Sarah's courage inspired you, if you believe that voices like hers deserve to be amplified, please subscribe to Timeless Stories. Hit that like button. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, because these aren't just stories. They're reminders that no matter how small someone tries to make you feel, your voice matters. Your truth matters. You matter. Thank you for listening. And remember, the sound of laughter can poison the air, but the sound of truth can shatter empires. Until next time.